and writer, and hopefully many of you have had a chance to get his books. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Chris Mullin.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry this is rather rushed. If you want to bring up some chairs, ladies and gentlemen, in the back there. All right.
The exercise is fine.
What I thought I'd do is, since Jeremy was elected, a very British coup has come back into fashion. There have been 2 reprints since he was elected. So I thought I'd just tell you the background to the story, and after that, and that's sort of fairly light-hearted, as you might imagine. If anybody's got some questions, I think we'll have a bit of time for questions on any subject you care to ask about after that. But I'll just tell you how British coup came to pass. I was coming back from the 1981 Labour Party conference in the company of Stuart Holland, who was then a Labour MP, Tony Banks, who later became a Labour MP, and Peter Hayne, who later became a Labour MP. And if you remember, 81 was when Ben was at the height of his powers, and the political landscape was really quite different. They were ahead in the polls, believe it or not, and there was a serious possibility, it was thought, that Tony Ben could become Prime Minister. And you remember Reagan was busy about to bring in cruise missiles, and so it was a wholly different political landscape to the one in which we now live. And one of our numbers said, what do you think would happen if Tony, how would the establishment react if Tony Benn were to become leader? And somebody else said that would make an interesting subject for a novel. And whereupon Stuart Holland said, well, the previous August, by the swimming pool in Greece, he had tapped out 4 chapters of exactly such a novel. And Peter Hayne said, well, he and a friend had circulated a proposal to publishers for a novel along those lines. I thought, well, I'd better get on with it. So I did, and it was published in 1982. One of the things, when you write books as I do, one of the most useful things is not the good reviews that necessarily do the trick, it's the denunciations. That you can't improve on a high quality denunciation. And immediately we were denounced by Sir Ian Gilmore. A very grand, and I have to say, fundamentally decent Tory, entirely different from some of those governments I got to know in later years. But I quoted him at the beginning, an extract from a book that he wrote, which implied, I thought, that there were circumstances in which if democracy let you down, that other measures might have to be taken. And he said I'd taken it out of context, and he got totally upset. He wrote to the Times about this, and the correspondence followed in the Times. And as a result of which, sales of the hardback in Hatchards, the top people's bookshop in Piccadilly, briefly exceeded those in Collett's, the left-wing bookshop in Charing Cross Road. And we sold the book initially to, I used to work on Tribune at the time, and we used to sell the book, we had an advert in the back of the paper. And the first cheque for £7.95, which was then the going rate for hardback, came in from the American Embassy. Kid you not. And so we wrapped up the book and sent it off and waited to see what would happen next. And the next thing that happened was an invitation to lunch with the minister at the American Embassy, the minister's most important person after the ambassador. And so there came a day when he sent his bulletproof Cadillac to Tribune's multi-storey headquarters in Gray's Inn Road to convey me to his mansion in Kensington. And I thought, well, there'll be a lot of us there. I don't. But when I got there, I discovered it was just him and me, one of his officials, and a Filipino butler. So I said, what on earth I wasn't even the editor of Tribune, for God's sake. What on earth are you bothering with a minnow like me for? He said, well, I reckon you're among the top 1,000 opinion formers in this country. so I said, well, I must be about number 990. He said, the other 999 have been here too. And then events conspired to make it topical. As I mentioned, the cruise missiles and all the rest of it. But a number of things that in the novel are only speculation began to come to pass. So, for example, I had a spy on the General Council of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. It turned out to be a chap called Harry Newton, who'd been working for MI5 for years. I had someone in the BBC betting the personnel files of people who. It had always been rumoured there was such a person, but no evidence of that. Stamping the personnel files of those who were ideologically unsound, whose careers were not progressive on a certain way. That turned out in 1986 to be Brigadier Ronnie Stoneham, who occupied room 105 in Broadcasting House and was stamping upturned Christmas trees on the personnel files of people whose careers were not to progress. I think probably account for the fact that I remained a sub-editor for my entire time at the BBC in the 70s. And of course a few things had occurred that were in the 70s already by the time this novel was published. You remember Brigadier General Sir Walter Walker, who was raising a private army in the mid-1970s to take over the country in the event of a breakdown of law and order, which he was confidently expecting. It used to be said when later on he was sort of brushed off by people who say, well, he's something of a nutter, but actually he'd been the Commander-in-Chief of NATO Northern Europe. And then the rather more sinister Colonel David Stirling, who was the founder of the SAS, he too set up something called GB75 with somewhat the same objectives. I think less of us would have survived if he'd been in charge. And of course there had been, well within the lifetime, I think, of many of the people here, not everybody, an attempt to overthrow the Howell Wilson government, which wasn't particularly left-wing. Do you remember Cecil Harmsworth King, the owner of the Daily Mirror, amongst other things? And he was the Rupert Murdoch of his day. He was the biggest media mogul. And one morning in 1968, he published the whole front page of the Daily Mirror with "Enough is enough." He wanted to set up a businessman's government which would be presided over by Lord Mountbatten, with whom he had some talks on the subject. Sir Solly Zuckerman, who was the, I think, chief scientific advisor of the Ministry of Defence, said, "Don't have anything to do with this, Dickie, it is treason," as indeed it was. And the result was that Cecil Harmsworth King fell from power. He had to resign. So anyway, overthrowing Labour governments, destabilising Labour governments, it wasn't entirely fanciful. So, and of course we were, by the early 80s, there was a possibility, and the right-wing media were working themselves up into a frenzy of the possibility of a Ben-led Labour Party. And they weren't doing it on the grounds they thought he was a loser, they thought he just might win. Because we were ahead of the polls almost till the Falklands War, if you remember. Thatcher was busy dismantling much of our manufacturing industry. I think they lost a third of it, didn't they, in the first 3 years of the government. And one day after I was elected, I, along with a number of other colleagues, got an invitation to go to lunch with the Director General of the BBC, whose name was Marmaduke Hussey, the only Marmaduke I've ever met. And the purpose of the lunch was to discuss. The purpose of the lunch was to discuss the broadcasting bill, which was then just a gleam in Mrs. Thatcher's eye. But halfway through this lunch, we had the entire top brass of the BBC around this table. I said, because it wasn't long after Brigadier Stoneham had been rumbled, I said, who now works in room 105 now that Brigadier Stoneham has retired? And all around the table you could hear the sound of knives and forks. Marmaduke, choking on his smoked salmon, said, I think this is one for you, Patricia. There was a lady down the end of the table called Patricia. I think she was the secretary of the company, the BBC. And she hummed and she hard. She couldn't remember his name, but she thought it was a special assistant to the... I said, yes, what's his name and what does he do? And even though we had the top brass of the BBC round the table, none of them could could supply the answer to this quite simple question. So I said, I tell you what, we're only 2 floors up. Why don't I do that? Knock on the door. Oh, I won't do that. He said, no. We'll write to you. And after a bit of prompting, they did write to me. And sure enough, it was a major hodder. Sure enough, and they were pains to assure me that his job description was very different from that of Brigadier Stoneman's, but it looked remarkably similar to me. Anyway, they were still at it. They'd been caught red-handed, and they were still at it.
Yeah.
That's the late 1980s. So all of this. Oh, and then, of course, 1986, Spy Catcher. Do you remember Peter Wright? Senior member of MI5, completely paranoid organisation that it was, paralysed by infighting. I mean, you think the Labour Party's bad, but I think MI5 was absolutely riven, and absolutely no use in dealing with the enemies of the state in those days. I think it's changed, I must say, in fairness now. But in those days, and Peter Wright had devoted much of his career to attempting to prove that Sir Roger Hollis, the head of MI5, was a Soviet agent. And he referred in his book to bugging and burgling his way across London, and to the fact that he and a small number of people, colleagues, who were worried about extremist government taking power, were taking steps to counteract this possibility. It was never quite clear how many of them were involved in that, but anyway, you remember the terrible fuss. Mrs. Thatcher tried to ban the book. She did ban the book. And no, it's not. No. It's very difficult to find books actually in a country like ours. It became a bestseller, if you remember. I was talking about denunciations at the beginning. You can't ask for more than that, but the government tries to ban you if you're trying to sell a book. So, and all that lent a certain credence to the plot in the Great British Coup, which, as you probably know, is about a left-wing government led by a chap called Harry Perkins, who is elected by surprise and attempts to chuck out the American bases, and the government gets stabilised. I'm sorry to say he loses. Another heroic defeat. The book is full of those. So, and then there was a film made of it, if you remember, in which a wonderful Irish actor called Ray McAnally played the lead. Sadly, he died shortly afterwards. But so the book's been in print now for 35 years. Is that right? 34 years. 34 years. Some years later, when would it be? Early 90s, I think. I went to Ipswich and gave a talk to a book club, and there was a man sitting down the back called Peter Hardyman Scott. Now, Peter Hardyman Scott was a household name in the 70s. He was the BBC's chief political correspondent, the Nick Robinson of his day. Everybody knew who he was, although by now he was a relatively obscure figure. But in retirement, he'd written thrillers, and he told me that around the time that mine was published, he was just in the process of completing his own novel on this very thesis, and took it to his publishers, and they said, "Well, you can't. It's been done. We can't publish it." And now I was very lucky, because if he got there first, nobody had ever heard of me. If they had heard of him, I would have been gone on. So I'm very grateful for that. I'll just I want to leave a bit of time for questions. I'll just tell you my George Bush story, which is unrelated to anything else I've said this evening, and then we'll have a few questions. Must leave at 10:30 if somebody would nudge me when we get there. What's the time now? There you go, we've got plenty of time, yes. So, when I was a Foreign Office Minister, well, you know, when the American President comes, he comes amid massive security. Helicopters overhead, big men with number one haircuts and earpieces appear all over the place. Convoy of blacked out armoured Land Cruisers is flown in for the occasion. And he came on, I think it was a state visit. And his last engagement was to have breakfast with Tony Blair in number 10. And then we were to come out the front door of number 10, walk through the gates opposite into the Foreign Office courtyard, and then turn right and up the grand staircase and hold a farewell press conference. So I thought, well, it's not every day the American president comes to my place of work. So I think I'll go and watch this. So I went down, stood on the other side of the great courtyard in the centre of the Foreign Office. And there was nobody else there at all except for an agitated security man who I think was being told through his earpiece that to get that civilian inside. And I'm afraid the civilian pulled rank shamelessly. I said, no, I'm a minister, I'm staying, thank you very much. In due course, George and Tony appeared on the other side of the square. And as they were turning to go up the grand staircase, George looked in my direction and went like that. And I thought, well, that's very odd because I wasn't waving at him, you understand? And I looked at the windows, there was nobody up there. And that evening I ran into Tony Blair in the House of Commons. He said, I saw you in the Foreign Office this morning. He said, I told George you were one of his greatest fans.
Tell George's one of his favourite ones.
So
greatest fans.
I brought some copies of A Very British Coup with me, and some copies of the diaries. You bought all the copies of the diaries that I brought with me. There's still some British Coup left if anybody wants. Questions on any subject you care to name, I'm not sure.
Conspiracy here really so much, and I must admit I haven't read your book yet,
right.
So I want you to do that, and I'll do that over the next few days. What do you think when we have Jeremy now as our leader, and the left tries to get one back up the Blairites and the Brownites over the years that have been so badly mistreated? What do you think is the way forward now?
The way forward is not to get involved in trying to get one back at the Blairites and the Brownites, but to try and focus on the real enemy, who are called the Conservative Party.
I was listening to you about Secret Service at the BBC and all that.
Yep.
And I wondered, I was thinking about the David Shaver thing. Do you know about anything?
I know a little bit about him, completely bonkers. Completely utterly bonkers. But I think he believed he was sent by God eventually. Do you remember that bit?
Oh yeah, but when he was blowing the whistle, was he actually...
Oh, I don't know, there must have been some grain of truth there. I mean, there were a lot more reliable people than him who blew the whistle. There was a woman called Kathy Massiter. And her, what she basically said was she resigned from the service on the grounds that part of it was spying on left-wing organisations that, whether you agree with them or not, were not a threat to the established, to the security of the country. And that's what she blew, like CND, for example.
But you say bonkers, but he was put in prison.
I think if you think you've been sent by God to save us.
Well, but do you think that happened after his imprisonment?
But it did happen after he was in prison. I mean, in prison to define some sort of injunction, I think. I can't remember what it was all about. But no, I do not think that he's a reliable witness.
No,
I'm putting it more generously now. Have you noticed? I've got the last
You're on camera, yeah.
How was he?
No, I'm saying that if you're looking for evidence, no. I'm saying if you're looking for evidence that the security service was abusing its powers in the 80s, there's quite a lot of witnesses for that proposition. That's great. That's leaving aside. But I'm saying there's better ones than David Sheller. That's it.
Would you prefer to be a minister under Corbyn?
Not a choice that really was on offer in my day. It would be interesting. I do my humble best. I'd be very happy to be put in charge of dismantling our nuclear deterrent.
Here, here. £100 million
Which
waste
gets
of
us into
money.
endless trouble, of course. The people the best placed to do it are the Tories, actually. If they got up one morning and said, we're getting rid, we can't afford it, it's not actually deterring anybody, we're going to phase it out, then we know virtually no fuss. No, 9-minute one done.
We waited a long time for that.
I think it could wait a while. There was a very good news night about a month, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and which was devoted wholly to the discussion of Trident. And all the usual suspects were on parade. Michael Fallon talking up the Soviet threat, the Russian threat. Admiral Lord West saying the Americans would be shocked, he said, if we were not to renew it. And then up pops Nancy Soderbergh, who was the American ambassador to the UN. She had a kindly smile on her face. She didn't want to upset us, but she said, actually, it's of no relevance whatsoever. She said, what did she say? It was a symbolic, of symbolic value. And the interviewer, Kirsty, really got very agitated about this and said, but how could we guarantee that, you know, the Russians wouldn't attack us, and that she said, well, you are under the American nuclear shield. NATO is under the American nuclear shield, to which what's her name said, well, she said, but supposing the Americans change their mind. And she does smile, kind of, they're not going to change their mind, it's permanent for the foreseeable future. And then she added, for good measure, she said it was extremely difficult to persuade countries like Iran not to get nuclear weapons when the French and the British were insisting on having them. She completely shocked effortlessly, without sort of going on about it. Very, very amusing to watch. Somebody else, yes, gentleman there, yes.
Yeah, question about, I read something you wrote about electoral pacts and different parties standing down in certain seats and us.
Oh yes, yes, yes.
And that's a big emotional issue here in Brighton, you know, with pavilions on.
Yes.
It's a very big active party, and we have a big emotional, you know, engagement with the Greens.
Yes,
and so
I do
on. But
understand.
the logic of your argument is very indisputable. So I'd be really interested to hear you articulate how you think we can do that, we can promote that and beat the Tories.
Yeah, well, we're in a more difficult, although they've only got a majority of 12 overall, which is quite small by historical standards, though they're behaving, or they were behaving until recently, as though they've got a majority of 100. We are in difficulty, and the difficulty is this, that we're not left-wing enough for the southern middle classes, with all due respect to any southern middle classes.
I beg exception.
I'm sorry, we're too left-wing for the southern middle classes, and we're not left-wing enough for the Scots. So we're between a rock and a hard place. And it is not likely, in the next 20-odd years, that the Scots are going to change their minds very decisively. So a non-Tory government can only get elected, in my view, now of course I could be quite right, we never turn in politics, can only get elected if, under a first-past-the-post system, if there was an anti-Tory alliance. And for that, you would need the Greens and the Liberals and Labour to get together and only put up one candidate in, say, 100 marginal seats. And yes, that would involve sacrifices. You'd certainly have to give up the one Green here, and probably let the Greens have one in Bristol, perhaps. The Lib Dems are the only people who could stand a chance of defeating the Tories in the South West. The only ones, there's no point in us. So, of course, that's very painful, and I see you all looking sceptical. The alternative is likely to be an even longer period of opposition than we currently face.
Oh
so
my
think
God.
about it. We've got plenty of time to think about it.
Thanks, sorry for such a difficult question.
That's a very good question. I believe you have to face up to hard
Yeah,
choices.
I
I
agree.
understand it's a hard choice, especially down here in Brighton. So, Carol.
Difficult audience.
You've had a long, distinguished political career. What's your
Well, we won't take a vote on the distinguished, but I have no idea.
what's your the one thing you can say that I changed something because I was a member of Parliament? What was
Northern
the one
Ireland.
thing? Well,
No, I didn't have to do. I didn't have anything to do. I didn't have
no,
anything
but
to
what
do.
that you personally think?
Well, I don't even think that obviously is in my case. I mean, every MP can point to things they change one way or another, large and small. Usually, the best things we did as a team. The national minimum wage, which I regard as one of the great achievements of the last Labour government. There was real spring in my step when I went through the lobby in the middle of the night, because the Tories, of course, were filibustering. Nothing like a bit of social injustice to keep them up all night. So those things, we were all part of a team, and we all were enthusiastic about that. But I suppose if you're looking for something that I think probably is down to me. It's the miscarriage of justice cases, which incidentally were not to do in Northern Ireland. They were about the British.
That's right, indeed.
Rotten at that time, having put away the wrong people, 18 in all, for all the big IRA bombings of the mid-1970s. 18 of them had to be released. And then, of course, and it led to reforms. I mean, that rotten police squad, the serious crime squad, who've been holding plastic bags over people's heads getting confessions. Lots and lots of convictions had to be quashed as a result of their being disbanded. Forensic scientists had to change their practices, and something called the Criminal Cases Review Commission, or it was the Royal Commission, Criminal Cases Review Commission. I mean, there were plenty of other people involved in those campaigns, but I think I lit the spark.
Can I ask, where do you stand on proportional representation versus first past the post as you just mentioned?
I am against proportional representation on the grounds it is a recipe for permanent coalition, and it gives disproportionate power to the small parties of coalitions. I'm against that. I am in favour, and I wish we'd gone for it. On
AV.
Say it again. AV. Thank you very much. Yes, we made a big mistake. We remember the Tories, of course, were absolutely against it. Now that ought to have caused us to think.
That indeed.
Why were they absolutely against it? Because they don't think it was in their interest. But we were wishy-washy on the subject. The Liberals, who've been campaigning for electoral reform for years, were going around saying, "Well, it's not what we want. We only want the pure." But it's all that was on offer. And that would have enabled honest voting. It would have got you out of the problem that I just described a moment ago. Because if you're Green down here, you could have voted Green first and Labour second. If you're UKIP, you could vote UKIP first. I'm putting this in an impartial manner. You could put UKIP first and Tories second, if that's what you want. But at the moment, you risk, by voting for your first choice, you risk putting in an MP of exactly the opposite,
yes, indeed,
achieving the exact opposite result to the one you want to. See, I have a better example, Northumberland. I live in the north of Northumberland nowadays, and the more votes the Labour candidate got, the larger the Tory majority. That's the stark reality. The only party that could defeat the Tories in Northumberland was the Lib Dems, who held the seat for 40 years under Alan Reid, who was a very good MP. So that's the stark reality. If you're a Labour voter in Northumberland, you can vote for the Labour candidate. It actually didn't make any difference because the Tories had a big swing. That's fine. You do need to have in the back of your mind, and we all know it's true, the more votes the Labour candidate gets, the bigger the Tory majority. And the reason Alan Reid held that seat for 40 years is because the Labour vote basically dilutes to the Liberal Democrat vote.
They support.
Hang on, you've had several votes.
Thank you. It's really just two comments on your answers to two questions.
Yes, go on.
One about your contribution as in Parliament as a minister. And can I say, as one of the local MPs at the time, that and it might have figured very small in your career, but the support that you gave at the time to those of us who were lobbying for the National Park in South Downs.
Yes.
Was really very much appreciated, and helped to keep that issue going until the time when we actually won that. And got so, it might have compared to some of the other things that you've mentioned, but I think us locally, that's you to have certainly contributed to.
That's the thing about being in government. Hundreds of little decisions, and nobody really hears about, thinks about, and do make a difference.
If I could just make a comment on the second thing that you said, I'm one of those who would be utterly opposed to us standing down a Labour candidate in favour of a Green candidate. And I would just add that what the suggestion of that does not take into account is that it's quite likely, come the next general election, the constituency boundaries down here will be very different to what they are at the moment, and the Green candidate might well become an irrelevance in what are likely to be the two constituencies that we have defined. So I'm not asking.
No,
this
I
for a
understand.
comment
I
from you on
understand
that,
it's a painful issue
but
down here.
But I just think that the boundary changes might well make us, whatever our views on it, think again about whether Labour should be standing.
The boundary changes may make our position worse anyway, which is what I'm always very keen on.
In some cases.
Well, I hope they help you down here. That's what I can say. Yes.
Can I just ask you what you think about the royal family and their influence on our...
Yeah, well, I'm with Jeremy on this. What Jeremy said when he was asked, he said, we're not going there. And I think he meant by that, we've got quite enough problems on our hands. I mentioned to Dal, though, what Prince Charles said to me once. He said, I came out of some event, there was a man standing with a placard saying, abolish the monarchy. And he said, I just restrained myself from going up to him and said, fine, I'll stand for president. So don't think you'll get rid of him necessarily. Anybody else? Right, are we done?
Yeah.
Yep, we're done. Okay. If anybody wants a copy of the Regulus coup, this is your final shot.